What are some of the aspects of competition that actually change your training, both from mental makeup perspective and also physical training perspective? And that would be a question to start with.
Yeah. So cycling is one of those disciplines, at least at the in the competitive side, where there's a lot of different flavors of it, and being part of a sport that's nascent, where specialization hasn't really taken root. You end up with cyclists in a particular discipline of road cycling who can also compete, who competes over distances of like a 40-kilometer time trial, which takes an hour, or a 120 or 160 kilometer road race, which takes 3 to 5 hours. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I can also switch my focus to like a track event, a 4-kilometer pursuit, which takes 4 minutes, right? So all of them touch on very different bioenergetic systems, right? One is like fast glycolysis, the other is like, aerobic with a neuromuscular at the end. And so my training really ends up being really specific to the event that I'm focusing on. And at different times of the year, it kind of involves just kind of switching things up a little bit. And usually my formula of specificity in the past, when I was first kind of in this space and exploring, training paradigms and training modalities, I would always freak out. It's like, oh, I have a road race that's 3 hours. And then like a month later, I have an event that's like an hour long, and I would freak out about it. But over time and with experience, I've learned that, as long as you keep a high level of kind of basal aerobic and anaerobic fitness, like 4 to 8 weeks, 8 weeks ideally, of like specificity really kind of helps you sharpen up towards like a specific, racing demand, And so I have this formula that's kind of set that works. And of course, as far as the mental aspect of it, that's also quite different because, a 4-minute effort is a different kind of pain to a 40-minute effort, to an hour-long effort, to a 3-hour effort, right? And so that's a little bit more of, once you're familiar with what the pain or the discomfort you're going to experience is, and once you develop like a toolkit to manage that different kind of discomforts, it's kind of like a plug and play kind of thing, For a 4-minute effort, you can't really let the mind wander. And every minute of those 4 minutes, you really have to just focus on like certain process, kind of tools, For a 4-minute effort, it's like the basic thing I focus on is cadence, I just tell myself, tap, 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 cadence, right? For a 3-hour effort, on the other hand, my process focus would be eat and drink, because if you don't fuel and hydrate over a 3-hour effort, you're not going to have that glycogen at the end to finish it off, right? So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about how the physical preparation and the mental preparation is slightly different.
That's really cool. At what point in time, like in this entire journey, did you actually start thinking about nutrition in a super serious way? Or was that from day one?
Good question. And to be honest, I am one of those riders, when I first started out, nutrition was just about, at least in an event, I didn't realize the significance of it, And as I started competing here at the elite level and also representing India, kind of an international competition, I was like, okay, nutrition is important, and it's important on race day, and it's important like in the 4 weeks leading into it to sharpen up, right? It's not until actually a month before I connected with you guys that, I was starting to think, okay, 10 years in this sport at a top level, I've got maybe a couple more years to stay competitive, where I want to be competitive. And, I feel like I've maximized. At some point, you reach this phase where, okay, you're training 30 hours a week, right? Professionals train just as much. I've maximized my power, the power I can develop on the bike, just through years of training. I've barely seen any big changes in my power at VO2 max and power at threshold, right? So what's the other thing I can optimize? And for me, I've always felt like nutrition was almost the easiest thing to optimize, because with cycling and endurance sport, the training effects and your progression is cumulative. you can't get from a threshold power of X to a threshold power of Y in 3 months. It takes like seasons of progressive overload, right, and consistency. Whereas I always felt like nutrition was one of those things where if I set my mind to it and said, okay, I really want to optimize my weight and get to this, optimal racing weight, I felt like that could happen very quickly, And then when I've worked with nutritionists in the past, but I never found it to be really effective. And I think a part of it was because I wasn't mentally committed to the idea of committing to, that razor sharp focus on nutrition. But then kind of with the CGM and things like that, all of a sudden I could start to quantify the impact of food and things in some way, and so I was like, okay, now I can see what's happening when I eat, and it was almost like having that data stream kind of empowered me a little bit to say, hey, let's this is something new. Let's try and see if we can optimize for weight. And in fact, the last 6 months, even a couple of months before I started working with you guys, was the first time in my life that I actually tried to optimize for weight. And I got to my lowest racing weight / lowest weight ever that I've reached as an athlete or a human, ever since I was like 10, 11 years old, but functional, athletic weight, and so, yeah, I mean, it's something that I only started looking at recently, and I've only started optimizing for it recently. So it's for me, it's like all new, in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to know. I think what I recollect from, and obviously nowhere close to the level of cycling, but I remember my brevet days almost 10 years back. The classic principles around fueling would be around carb loading. So you load as much carb as possible day or 2 days before a brevet, and the more you can load, probably you'll end up finishing. Your probability of finishing will be higher, essentially, right? That's how crude the nutrition science was for me as well, almost 10 years back, uh, and I think and I was trying to read a lot more about nutrition along the way, like 10 years ago, but I think all the information that I got largely was around, okay, there is a lot of information actually came from bodybuilders, people who actually wanted to make changes quickly in their body composition. And a lot of that science is very solid, extremely solid, right, in terms of how they change the macros, and but it's very, very stressful as well. Like, how do you actually maintain a weighing scale, and the food weighing scale rather, and measure everything in precise order and sequence, and in precise quantities. But it's definitely a super effective piece of science. I always find it fascinating, like how effective it is in terms of how it works, right? It's almost like the human machine is very, very much boring and calculated.
Yeah, and it's very elastic. It can change very quickly, right? With nutrition, I feel like you can make certain changes, and if you commit to it, you can make these changes quickly. Whether they're lasting and whether those habits are sustainable, that's a different topic altogether. Yeah.